Hello, everybody in Fine Arts 109. Hope you all enjoyed your spring break, your week away from keeping up with online class. I'm guessing this past week was not terribly different than previous weeks since we've all just been stuck at home for a month now. But at least you didn't have to worry about discussion boards. But we are back in it. Of course, we've got 4 more weeks of class here before the end of the semester, so we will get right into the swing of things. I did want to mention about class-related business. Um, like just said a second ago, there we are getting towards the end of the semester, and so there are two major things that you'll have to do towards the end of the semester here. We'll do a final writing assignment. I'm going to put together the writing prompt for that during this week here. I should have it up middle of the week at the latest. I think it's just about finding the time in the midst of watching kids and doing my multiple jobs. And then there's also going to be a final exam. Like the previous test we've taken, this is one that you will just do on Brightspace at the end of the semester here. A little imperfect, but that is, you know, what we got. And so that is what we will do. Um, yeah, so the details of that will be on Brightspace in the next couple of weeks here. I'm also toying a little bit with the idea. Feel free to give me any feedback about this that you like. I'm toying with the idea of maybe dropping screening responses in these last few weeks here, letting the discussion board kind of carry that load for us. So the expectation is, if we did that, I think the expectation would be that everybody writes 2 posts per week on the discussion board, one about the previous week's screening and one about the discussion topic for that week. Because it felt a little bit like the screening responses and the discussion board about the previous week's screening, it's kind of covering the same material, which, yeah, we're still figuring this stuff out, so there's always room for improvement or refinement. If you think that would work better, just 2 discussion board posts per week, no screening response, let me know in an email, in a comment, anything like that. But that's the direction I think I'm leaning in right now. Anyway, our topic for this week is sticking with American cinema here, and I did want to mention a little bit about this, especially with just the relatively small number of times we were even scheduled to meet before the semester got thrown into chaos, meant that I had to make a decision about what to focus on when it comes to the topics of the course. We did want to look at global cinema where and when we could, hence that week with European cinema in the 20s, with Rashomon, and with Breathless back, in regular life. But the course does lean more heavily towards Hollywood and American cinema. I justify that based on the fact that, we're taking this class in Chicago, and Hollywood has been the dominant force in global cinema for over a century now, and also just it it feels like I fall into the realm of tokenism when I spend, vast amounts of time on Hollywood, and I'm like, oh, hey, you know what else is going on? France. Um, it's an imperfect system. It's an introductory survey course. We're doing the best we can, but there is more in global cinema that we will get to in the next few weeks. Anyway, jumping back to American cinema here, our topic today is, I would say, the last big movement in American cinema before what you might call contemporary movies, or the contemporary moment, the current moment in American cinema. And that's the rise of indies back in the late 1980s and especially in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I do want to point out, this is a very particular time period. It's a very particular set of films and filmmakers. But I think you can also kind of say that indies here, independent movies, um, were a they were as much a marketing tool as they were anything else. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute here. But safe to say, independent film production has been going on for the entirety of cinema history. If you think of somebody like Oscar Micheaux, the black filmmaker who was based in Chicago back in the 1910s, he was an independent filmmaker. He raised his own money and he distributed outside of the studio system. That's what we mean by independent. You raise the money outside of the studios, and maybe you rely on the studios for distribution, getting movies into theaters, maybe, maybe not. But it means that you don't have the corporate control of Hollywood. That is something that's existed for a long time. The studios obviously have been a major, major force for a long time, but you do see the rise of a very distinct, newly energetic and newly forceful indie movement beginning in the late 1980s. And there are two major things that help push this. Number one, there is the rise of film festivals. Film festivals are these grand events. I've been to the Chicago Film Festival. I was about to say I've never been to any, but I have been to the Chicago one. Essentially, they are week-long events held all over the world. The oldest ones are in Europe, the Cannes Film Festival; in France, the Venice Film Festival; in Italy, and then there's in the United States a couple of big ones. New York is, I think, the most highly attended, but the most influential is one founded back in the 1980s, the Sundance Film Festival. That's held in early January every year in Park City, Utah, which is a skiing resort outside of Salt Lake City. It's founded by Robert Redford, who was a major movie star, director of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, still hanging around, though I think he's retired from acting the past year or two here. I think he's great. I really like Robert Redford. Um, and he spawns the Sundance Institute, named after a character of his from an old Western, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, as a way of cultivating independent voices in American cinema, maybe giving funding, helping out with students, these sorts of things. Eventually, they put together a film festival where they invite independent filmmakers to screen their movies to potential buyers every January. This is something that when it starts is a neat little experiment, but it's not all that much until 1989 when a little movie called Sex, Lies, and Videotape, directed by a guy named Steven Soderbergh, is released, screened at the Sundance Film Festival, and audiences love it, critics love it. It gets snapped up by a small company. Actually, I'm double checking this right now. I want to make sure that I got this. Got it right. Snapped up by a small company called. I swear to God, if I got that wrong, I would have been so mad at myself. Um, Miramax. Okay, I had it right. I doubted myself for a second, but Miramax. Miramax is a small independent distribution company run by the now infamous Harvey Weinstein, just convicted of rape a couple of weeks ago, and apparently terrorized um, women in the entertainment industry for decades. But Weinstein's Miramax Film Company buys this movie for at the Sundance Film Festival, takes it to the Cannes Film Festival, the oldest and the most prestigious film festival in the world, where it wins the Palme d'Or, the best film at the festival, despite being this tiny little American independent, starring the biggest name in it is James Spader, right? Um, this goes on to be a popular success, a critical success, and it shows that there's a marketplace for movies that are not blockbusters and also are not typical studio productions. Sex, Lies, and Videotape is about exactly what it sounds like it's about. And that is something that is exciting for a lot of audiences who've been starved for this sort of content since the end of the new Hollywood era, essentially in the late 1970s. Now, the videotape in that movie's title is the other major factor that helps with the rise of independent films. This is a time period where the film festivals, Sundance, Berlin, Cannes, Venice, Toronto, New York, all of them become major focal points for the independent film movement because they are places where companies, filmmakers can take the work that they have been creating and show it to audiences, gauge the reaction, and then distributors, most prominently Miramax, can sweep in, buy it, release it, try to win a bunch of awards like the Oscars, and then make money off of that award's prestige. The awards prestige means that even if people are not seeing the movie in theaters, Sex, Lies, and Videotape never that widely distributed, but awards attract attention. They get you good press. You can slap them on the poster or notably on the VHS box. That's the other major thing that helps the rise of independent films. VHS. This is videotape. It was a brand new technology in the 1980s, quite expensive by our standards today, clunky, difficult to operate, terrible video and audio quality by the standards of what we're used to these days. But it meant you could watch a movie of your choosing in your home, and you didn't even have to own it. You could just go to Blockbuster and rent it. That's huge. That means that there is always a potential audience couple of minutes away from watching the movie that you've produced. That doesn't mean every independent film is going to be a success, but it means the odds of seeing a profit off of an independent production become much, much higher. If you can put together the money, that means that you can go to a film festival. You can try to get on the award circuit. You can try to make money in theaters, or you can try to make a lot more money in that lucrative home video market, both purchases and rentals. This is something that starts bubbling up beginning in 1989. Sexualizing Videotape is an example of that. Do the Right Thing, also 1989, another example of that. Movies like The Silence of the Lambs, which is it's kind of a fringe case if it's an independent or not, but that one's Best Picture at the Oscars in 1991. That starts to become the norm. Indie means quality. It means prestige. Uh, it means it's made for smart people. And people like to think that they're smart, so they go see the movies that make them think that they're smart, if only by association. And this is also something that starts to attract the attention of bigger and bigger businesses. I mentioned Miramax there. Miramax is an independent film distribution company when it buys Sexualized Videotape in 1989. They are not independent that much longer. They are bought by the Walt Disney Corporation in the early 1990s. So in 1994, they get another Palme d'Or winner. They win the best film at the Cannes Film Festival with Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, a 3-hour gangster buddy comedy. It's a hard movie to describe, but it is maybe the perfect example of just how offbeat, funky, independent these sorts of movies could be. It wins the Palme d'Or. It's nominated for a boatload of Oscars. Wins Best Original Screenplay, if I'm recalling correctly, though I'm not sure it won any others. Makes $100 million for Miramax Films when it's released in 1994. And it's worth noting that is now the revenue of Miramax, and Miramax is now a subsidiary of Walt Disney. That's the same summer that Walt Disney is making hundreds of millions of dollars more with The Lion King. This is sort of the interesting part of the indie movement to me. This genuinely does start as independent filmmakers working outside of the system, and there are examples of that happening all throughout the time frame of this movement, which I would say tapers off at the latest with the Great Recession in 2007, but you really start to see it kind of the high point is the late 90s, early 2000s. It tapers off by the middle of that decade, the middle of the 2000s. And I think part of the reason it tapers off is because technology is changing once again, but also just the fact that most of the indies by that point are made by the studios. Miramax is part of Disney. Other major independent film producers don't even hide who they are. The next most prominent, Fox Searchlight. That's part of 20th Century Fox, which of course has recently been bought by Disney, which means it's now a part of Disney. Disney sold Miramax about 15 years ago, so they had to buy another independent producer. And that becomes the case with a lot of independent studios. They become just small boutique studios or brands for the larger corporation that controls them. Focus Features is the awards bait independent boutique arm of Universal Pictures. Paramount briefly has Paramount Vantage. I don't think that exists any longer. Warner Brothers creates Warner Independent Pictures. Every studio does this sort of thing because there's a market there. They want to cultivate it. They want to win awards, but also because it's cheap. If you're a company like Disney, buying Miramax cost you a fair amount of money, but you just give the reins to the Weinsteins, let them buy a movie at a film festival. 9 times out of 10, maybe not 9 times out of 10. Most of the time, they know what they're doing. They win awards. I think Miramax won Best Picture one, two, three. What is it? 4 times in the decade between 1996 and 2006, if I'm recalling correctly. Each one of those then becomes a major box office success. And some of those movies. The movie Chicago, a bad movie, I would argue. Not horrible, just not good. Anyway, I think that kills the indie movement as much as anything else. Though I do also think that to some degree, the reason that there's not really an indie movement anymore is because there's so many new avenues for creating films. If you're an independent filmmaker, why do you need to rely on the Weinstein brothers at this point when you've got YouTube? Uh, why bother with the way things had been done back in the 1980s when the world has changed so dramatically since the 1980s. I think that's part of the other shift. The internet kills this movement just about as much as anything else. There's a lot of other factors that go into it, but I do think the indie movement is a distinctive one. It is sort of a revival of New Hollywood in some ways, but it's rarely as gritty or in your face. Quentin Tarantino is maybe the closest to that example of a pure New Hollywood sort of figure, but other major independent filmmakers like Soderbergh, like Wes Anderson, like Sofia Coppola, I'm trying to think of some others off the top of my head, Spike Jones, uh, they are they're part of the system to some degree. They start outside the system, but at this point, Wes Anderson has made most of his movies through the independent arms of major studios. A filmmaker like Greta Gerwig is a good example of somebody who breaks out as an actress for the mumblecore style of indie films in the mid 2000s. But a movie like Little Women, that was not independently produced. That was part of the studio system. It had the sort of shine of independence because it was nominated for awards and because that's not a movie that's a blockbuster ish, but not a blockbuster like Star Wars is a blockbuster. But that's a good example of how independent becomes just a brand, a marketing ploy, as much as it is anything else. All right. That is all for me this evening. Hope you have all been doing well, and I will see you in the discussion boards.